the Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change. Senator Whitehouse and I established this Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change this past January to draw congressional and public attention to climate change and to develop effective policy options to respond to this urgent challenge. In addition to Senator Whitehouse and myself, the other co-chairs are Congressman Rush, Senator Cardin, Congressman Blumenauer, and a man who held the co-chair in both houses, now Senator Markey. I'm pleased that the following members are with us. Senator Franken is with us, and others will be joining us soon. Today's forum focuses on the impacts of climate change on wildfires. This is a critically important topic, particularly to those of us in the West. Wildfires have always been a fact of life in the West and are integral to many ecosystems. But recently, we've been experiencing wildfire activity that is different and more dangerous. Longer fire seasons, more of the largest and most intense fires we've seen, more acreage burned, more homes and communities destroyed, and tragically more lives lost. Scientists tell us that these changes are not just random variability. Bigger and more intense fires are one of the red flags of climate change. According to scientists, climate change is causing hotter and dirtier conditions, earlier snow melt, and more outbreaks of pine bark beetles and other pests. And these factors are combining to make fires bigger and more destructive. A year ago, as the country suffered from drought, extreme heat, and historic wildfires, Congressman Rush and I wrote to the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee requesting a hearing on the wildfires and climate change. We never got a response even to our request. But we can ignore this threat no longer. When a fire can surge out of nowhere and kill 19 brave and well-trained heroes, we need to understand what is happening. That is why I'm very pleased we're able to hold this forum today. Today's forum will examine the link between climate and wildfires. We need to know what government should be doing to prevent this threat from getting worse, to protect communities, and to safeguard our wildland firefighters. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our highly distinguished participants. Before I introduce those who will be participating in telling us about this issue from their own experience and knowledge and expertise, I want to recognize Senator Whitehouse to make some remarks.
Thank you very much, Henry. I want to welcome Representative Lois Capps, who's joined us, and thank my friend Senator Franken for joining us. I want to particularly thank Chairman Waxman. This is the first round table that the Bicameral Task Force has done, and we intend to do others as well, but this is, I think, a great beginning. I want to very much appreciate our guests who have come here to share their perspective. I come from Rhode Island. This is not a problem that we face in our home state very much, but I know it affects many, many other states, and I've read the news about the hotter and drier weather, the addition of more fuel to these fires, and it appears we're seeing an extended fire season. It appears we're seeing more intense fires. It appears we're seeing more fires. It appears we're seeing bigger fires geographically. And I would like to learn more about this and learn more about the role that climate changes from carbon pollution are playing in that equation, because clearly when there's so much property at risk and, as we've seen tragically, also lives at risk, it's important that we understand this. So I'm grateful to the various witnesses and guests for being here, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce the witnesses, and then when we go to questions, we'll have Senator Franken and Congresswoman Capps lead off the questions of the witnesses. We first of all have Dave Cleaves. He's the advisor to the Chief on Climate and the U.S. Forest Service in the Department of Agriculture, where he leads implementation of the Forest Service's nationwide strategy for climate change response. Dr. Cleaves has been with the Forest Service for over 20 years, holding a variety of positions related to research and development, decision science, and risk analysis, including most recently the positions of Associate Deputy Chief of Forest Service Research and Development and Director of the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Dr. Cleves has a BS and an MS from Michigan State University and a PhD from Texas A&M University. Dr. Summers, a distinguished wildfire scientist with over 40 years of fire research experience, is representing the International Association of Wildland Fire. Dr. Summers retired from the Forest Service as Director of Forest Fire Research and is now a research professor affiliated with the East Fire Laboratory at George Mason University. He has served as co-chair of the National Wildlife Coordinating Group and vice president and board of directors member of the International Association of Wildland Fire. He helped found the International Association of Wildland Fire, the Joint Fire Science Program, and the U.S. Global Change Research Program initiatives. Dr. Summers recently served as the lead author of a Joint Fire Science Program report synthesizing the scientific understanding of fire history and climate change. Chief Eric Litzenberg is the fire chief of the Santa Fe, New Mexico Fire Department. He represents the International Association of Fire Chiefs here today and is a member of the Wildland Fire Policy Committee and an alternate member of the Wildland Fire Executive Council. He holds a master's degree in public administration and is working on a doctorate degree. Chief Litzenberg is a graduate of the National Fire Academy Executive Fire Officer Program and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security Executive Leadership Program. And of course, Chief Litzenberg is an experienced wildland firefighter. We also have here today Deputy Chief Rick Swan, another experienced wildland firefighter who is representing the International Association of Firefighters. Deputy Chief Swan recently retired as Deputy Chief of CAL FIRE, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, after 32 years of service. He's also Director and past Vice President of the California Department of Forestry Firefighters, IAFF, Local 22881. Deputy Chief Swan is currently working with San Diego State University's Wildland Fire Research Program on firefighter health and safety, and he's pleased he's here. I also want to welcome Joe Duda, the Deputy State Forester for the Colorado State Forest Service, who's representing the National Association of State Foresters. Mr. Duda has 37 years of extensive industry experience and forestry expertise in the private sector and public sectors. Among many other professional accomplishments, he has led development of the annual Colorado State Forest Service Forest Health Report and facilitated development of the Colorado Forest Action Plan. Mr. Duda holds a degree in forestry from Michigan's Technological University. While we're privileged to have these participants here today, it's hard to imagine a more qualified group to talk about the science and the impacts of climate change and wildfire. Dr. Cleves, why don't we start off with you to begin, and then we'll go down the list. And would you pull the microphone over to you so that we get your full testimony, and there may be a button on the base.
It's on. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Reed. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here in this conversational framework here that we have set up. There are a tremendous number of conversations going on within the administration now about the wildfire and the climate change wildfire connection, especially following the announcement of the President's Climate Change Action Plan. And as we go into that plan, you see wildfire and forest in all three of the major pillars. So many of those discussions are about adapting to the wildfire, climate-driven wildfire conditions, and then the role of the forest in mitigating climate change in the long run through sequestration and the impacts of wildfire on that role. I'll talk about in just a moment. What have we been seeing? I think you've very well synopsized what we've been seeing in the forest and what our scientists have been seeing on the ground. The length of the fire season increasing by more than 60 days over the last 10 years. The annual area burned by wildfire increasing more than 4 times what it was in the 1970s. The portion of the area burned by large fires has gone up 2 to 7 times. So most of that increase in acreage has been because of the large fires and the extreme part of the distribution of fires. The maximum size of the fire has gone up from 125,000 to 250,000 acres. And the portion of the area that's burned at the highest severity has gone up, especially in the southwest, by a factor of 2. So we have a big issue on our hands. It's an ecological issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social issue. And dealing with it means we have to understand it better and understand some of the related challenges. Some of those are that the insect disease and invasives impacts on a forest have tripled. What does that have to do with fire? It is that climate is the common driver of both the fire issue and the fuels issue, not only the growth of fuels, but the mortality, the death of the fuels that were at one time live trees that were insect or disease impacted. So this combination of these disturbances, we're seeing more and more a manifestation of climate as the common factor. So as we look at not just fire, but look at stressor complexes, we're seeing the need to adapt the forest and vegetation to be resilient to these combination of stressors. Another related challenge is that the wildland-urban interface, in other words, the structural and human values at risk has grown right along with the fire conditions themselves. So when you put the exposure of fire and the value at risk together, you get some of the increases that we see in structural losses. Structural losses have gone up by a factor of 5 in the last 10 years. So more and more structures are in the path of wildfire. Now I have some material on PowerPoints. My staff claims that my PowerPoints are a form of cruel and unusual punishment. So I did not bring them there available to you. So these are graphically displayed elsewhere. Okay. One of the impacts that we are wrestling with in the Forest Service and all the agencies are wrestling with is the mounting cost of fighting fire. In 2008, the cost of fighting fire went up to $3 billion. In the 70s, it was, even inflation-adjusted terms, less than half a billion a year.
$3 billion was when?
$3 billion.
What year?
In the 70s, it was about $500 million on the average.
$3 billion now.
$3 billion now.
This year.
Yeah, 2012, I'm sorry,
2012.
2012. Okay, that represents a direct cost, of course, to the taxpayer, but it also represents foregone work that we could be doing in the forest to adapt the forest better to burning conditions that are increasingly getting worse. So that there is an opportunity cost there that's quite high, and in our agency, when we bump up and go beyond our suppression budget, then those dollars are transferred out of other funds. We call it fire transfer to cover our suppression cost. And that work that we would have done in the forest on recreation, vegetation management, wildlife management, roads, doesn't get done until it's paid back. Eventually, most of it gets paid back, but the disruption there really creates problems in the partnerships that we use to do a lot of the work. So the last impact that we're seeing, or one of the last impacts, is that we're seeing changes in conditions in the forest. As forests change from one type to another, that are really accentuated and driven by fire. And some of our research projections also show that the forest carbon sink that we have, that is the role of the forest in sequestering carbon to offset something like 13 to 15% of the fossil fuel emissions in the rest of the economy, is weakening. One of the reasons that that sink is weakening is because of all the emissions that we're getting because of the increased wildland fire. So we have a number of issues underway. I think we'll get to our discussion about what we can do about some of those issues, but definitely there is a climate to fire link that we see today. Our projections are that it will increase in the future, and that by the first half of this century, we will see even twice the amount of fire that we see on the landscape that we do now. So that's it for my remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cleves. Dr. Summers, why don't we go with you next, solely because you're next on my list of people to have been introduced.
Very random.
Thank you on behalf of the International Association of Wildland Fire for the opportunity to participate in this important forum. The IAWF is an independent professional association representing members of the global wildland fire community. The association was formed to promote a better understanding of wildland fire in order to enhance natural resource management and firefighter safety. Climate and wildfires are a critical focus for promoting that understanding, as indicated in our 2007 policy statement on the subject. Quote, we anticipate that many key issues of importance to the IAWF, including firefighter and civilian safety, fire management expenses, the wildland-urban interface, and our core understanding of fire science and management will require greater understanding and recognition of the role of climate change in the years ahead. Wildfires have been an important part of the Earth's system for over 420 million years, shaping ecosystems in response to climate. When past climates changed, fire accelerated ecosystem changes to adjust to new climate conditions. Charcoal, tree ring, and other paleoecology records clearly demonstrate that climate change has been the dominant driver of fire regimes and fire risk through much of Earth's history. Fire regimes represent the cumulative characteristics of fire events over time, just as climate represents the cumulative characteristics of weather over time. For the past 10,000 years, humans have become increasingly important shapers of fire regimes, and we use fire to manage our environment, change natural resource fuel conditions through agricultural expansion, and emitted increasing amounts of greenhouse gases with resultant global warming. As long as greenhouse gases emissions continue to accelerate, and there is nothing to indicate the contrary, fire regimes will continue to shift to more frequent, larger, higher risk fires in the future. We are already seeing longer fire seasons and occurrence of more frequent large fires around the globe. When we look at fire on a global basis, every year we have seen one or more regions of the world that have experienced severe fire seasons, whether it is Texas or Australia or Russia or Greece or Brazil or Indonesia or Colorado or you name it. The patterns of severity are entirely consistent. Fuels desiccated by months of drought that burn over large areas suffering from locked-in heat waves. The droughts and heat waves are consistent with our understanding of how climate change is being manifested. The impacts of these globally observed trends in wildfire are hardly surprising. Increased cost, increased destruction of homes, increased health impacts of smoke, and increased loss of life, particularly for those engaged in suppressing fires and protecting communities. These impacts will only worsen in the future. If current greenhouse gas emission trends are not sharply reversed in the immediate future, we will see observed trends in wildfire risk accelerate. In the United States, it would not be surprising to see wildfire risk and impact significantly increase in areas of the eastern United States if heat and drought sufficiently desiccate fuels as forests transition to more savanna-type ecosystems. Since over 75% of the U.S. population resides in the east and over 50% of our forests are found there, an upward tick in fire risk would result in a nonlinear increase in human impacts, such as wildland-urban interface and prolonged big city smoke episodes. As a matter of fact, two of the most disastrous fires in U.S. history, Muskego and Hinckley, occurred in the Lake States area in the previous century. 25 years ago, Forest Service research highlighted climate change, the wildland-urban interface, and catastrophic fires as rising wildfire risk factors and areas needing significantly accelerated attention. In 1988, the atmospheric CO2 concentration was 367 parts per million. In 2007, when IAWF issued our climate change policy statement, it was 384 parts per million. This year, it will exceed 400 parts per million. An almost 10% increase in CO2 over 25 years of mitigation inaction. In spite of documented scientific warnings, it does give one reason for concern. Immediate but unlikely action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions would only bend the greenhouse gas increase curve. But even a slight bend of that accelerating curve would bring some hope. Fire management must be prepared to adapt to increasing fire risk in the years ahead. We have no choice. Let me emphasize that recent fire trends are not the new normal. Rather, they are the early steps on what will be an increasingly steeper fire risk path facing fire managers. Realizing the past that is our future and remembering that the fundamentals of fire remain the same, it is fire regimes that are shifting in a more extreme direction, not the basics of fire. We can move forward with known fire management options that offer no regrets. These focus on recognizing and reducing fuels associated with the wildland-urban interface, reducing fuels, especially as hazardous fuel loads increase with climate change, and assuring that our firefighting organizations have the staffing, equipment, training, and policy direction needed to contain inherent risks as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. I'm going to call Chief Eric Litzenberg to give the next presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Waxman, Chairman Whitehouse, and members of the task force. I am Chief Eric Litzenberg. I'm the Chief of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm a member of the International Association of Fire Chiefs Wildland Fire Policy Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to represent local fire chiefs and emergency managers in a discussion about the impact of climate change on wildland fire. In 2012, wildland fires impacted every state except Delaware. In 2012, there were nearly 68,000 wildland fires, which burned 9.3 million acres of land. 86% were caused by human actions, and the remaining 14% were caused by lightning. These fires cost the U.S. Department of the Interior and the U.S. Forest Service over $1.9 billion to extinguish. Data from the National Interagency Fire Center clearly show that wildland fires have become bigger and more costly. When comparing the time period of 2006 to 2012 with 1999 to 2005, the average number of wildland fires increased by 2.5%, and the average number of acres burned per year increased by 15.6%. The average cost of the federal response to wildland fires during these two time periods also increased by 47.3%. Climate change may lead to ground conditions that are more prone to wildland fires. Other factors, in addition to climate change, may be to blame. Examples of these. First is expansion of the wildland-urban interface, also known as WUI. WUI is the term for communities located near wildland areas. The WUI has expanded as more structures have been built in rural and suburban areas. Also, declining funding for federal programs that support local wildland fire operations may be to blame. Since fiscal year 2010, Congress has reduced funding for the Volunteer Fire Assistance Grant by 26.9%. This grant helps small rural fire departments purchase supplies and train firefighters. There have been eliminated federal programs such as the Rural Fire Assistance Program that helps fire departments obtain equipment. However, Congress has not funded this program since fiscal year 2010. The IFC is combating the rise in wildland fire through the Ready, Set, Go program, which is also known as RSG. RSG helps residents prepare for the threat of wildland fire by improving fire awareness, teaching how to build a fire-safe community, and creating emergency evacuation plans. The IFC also supports the National Cohesive Strategy. This is an effort to improve coordination among local, state, and federal partners in their responses to wildland fire. The question is, what can Congress do? The IFC recommends Congress take several actions to minimize these destructive fires. Support for the Flame Fund Act. The Flame Fund was created in 2009 as a separate fund for wildland fire suppression activities in the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Congress created the Flame Fund so unspent appropriations for suppression would remain as a reserve for future years. Congress continues to fail to fund the Flame Fund appropriately, forcing the Forest Service and BLM to use non-emergency funds for suppression operations. We should support the national cohesive strategy, and Congress should continue supporting this effort and ensure it is fully implemented by all relevant federal agencies. And funding for the Volunteer Fire Assistance Grant should improve. Nearly 97% of wildland fires are extinguished by local resources. The VFA helps rural fire departments have the resources they need. As recently as fiscal year 2010, VFA was funded at $16 million. The House Subcommittee on Interior Appropriations recently recommended reducing these funds to $11.2 million. I urge you to return VFA to its fiscal year 2012 funding level of $13 million. Thank you again for the opportunity to attend this hearing, and I will be happy to answer questions about the slides.
Thank you very much. Now, I call on Deputy Chief Rick Swan.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me to speak about firefighter health and safety. My name is Rick Swan. I am representing the International Association of Firefighters. I started my career 33 years ago, retired this past November. I started off as a tailboard firefighter, worked my way up to a fire crew supervisor, then to a fire marshal, and then to deputy chief. As the other jobs that I had done, I also represent the International Association of Firefighters on the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association Technical Committee on Wildland Safety Clothing and Equipment, NFPA 1977. We write the technical data for our wildland safety clothing. We are seeing a dramatic increase in the number of fires, especially in California. In CAL FIRE, their 5-year average from January 1 to July 20 was almost 2,600 fires. Last year, that number was 2,700 fires. This year, to the same date, it's almost 4,000 fires. There's a variety of reasons for this. Land use factors, human-caused fires, hazardous fuel loads, insects, disease, and climate change. The effects these wildfires have are they threaten our lives, they threaten homes, businesses, and natural resources. Just a study of the San Diego County fires in 2003, the suppression costs were a little less than $50 million, but the total economic impact of that community was over $2.4 billion. Although firefighting response and effectiveness has improved, many of the basic health issues of wildland fire still remain a question. Maintaining and improving wildland firefighter health and safety is of foremost concern. We do not adequately understand the risks firefighters face, including exposure to smoke and carbon monoxide, and the connected stress of the substantially increased heart rates and core body temperatures over these extended periods of time and extended fire seasons. As stated, the fire seasons are getting longer. Just in my area alone, we were funded, and that's the way in most places our fire season is not necessarily an amount when the fires start actively occurring. It's a date on a calendar when your budget kicks in. And that used to be mid-May, where I'm from in San Luis Obispo County. It's now started off being in mid-April. And we're seeing this shift further and further forward, and seeing it shift further and further towards November and towards Christmas. In many places in Southern California, and Congressman Waxman, you're aware of this, it never stops. It's year-round. Unfortunately, we see the extended fire season, we see this continuing to grow and grow, but we are not seeing the same increase in staffing levels and funding to keep our facilities running at full steam. Good firefighters are not like a shovel. It takes 60 seconds to make a shovel, and years to gain the experience needed to command a crew of shovels. Fire behavior is a product of fuel, weather, and topography, where experienced eyes understand the picture, and it is because of these eyes that we rarely, thank God, see these tragedies that have occurred. It's time that we evaluate all aspects of wildland firefighting and wildland-urban interface issues by establishing a Blue Ribbon Commission to provide focus on things like adequately funding research of the health and safety issues facing overtaxed firefighters during these extended fire seasons, and equip them with modern, up-to-date technology. This is not just a California problem. We see it not only in Texas, Florida, and Colorado, but we see it in almost every state of America. In closing, I'd like to add, we can add more shovels quickly, but it takes years to learn how to use them safely. We must protect our most valuable assets, our firefighters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I want to hear now from, call on Deputy State Forester, Colorado State Forest Service, Mr. Joe Duda.
Thank you, Representative Waxman. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the National Association of State Foresters. As stewards of more than 2/3 of the country's state and private forest lands, state foresters provide outreach, technical assistance, and financial assistance, and fire protection in partnership with the state and private forestry branch of the U.S. Forest Service. I think we're all aware of the many benefits our forests provide, everything from carbon sequestration and storage all the way to clean water. But our forests are under threat now from a whole host of issues. I think everybody's aware nationally of the insect and disease issues we've had. They're huge issues in the West and in eastern forests. But I wanted to focus more specifically today on fire and the effects of changing climate. The costs of fire have increased dramatically. For the U.S. Forest Service, in 1991, suppression costs were 13% of the U.S. Forest Service budget. Last year, they were well over 40%. The problem that creates is in flat budget times, it takes program funds away that are really necessary to do the management work and fuel reduction that can help mitigate the effect of insect disease and fire. Some of the other implications are, and I'll echo what Chief Litzenberg said, the National Association of State Foresters was very supportive of the Flame Act. However, as he stated, it hasn't progressed as needed. And so a couple of the things that we would urge is for the U.S. Forest Service, or excuse me, for Congress to fully fund the Flame Act so that we don't have the fire bowering, even in times when those budget, excuse me, even in times when the U.S. Forest Service budget has been restored after borrowing, it does create disruptions to programs and continuity programs that are really necessary. I do have a report that NASF has prepared, and I would like to pass it out if possible. It's on communities at risk. There are 72,000 communities at risk across the country. One of the programs that state foresters use is the State Fire Assistance Program. It's part of U.S. Forest Service funding that we receive. State Fire Assistance helps develop state and local communities, develop preparedness and response capabilities. It helps train first responders for wildland fire, and it also helps with many educational things that we do to promote risk reduction and awareness of wildfire. We should also take a comprehensive look for all opportunities and authorities necessary to reduce U.S. Forest Service costs, including expanding the Good Neighbor Authority, making it permanent. Stewardship contracting should be made permanent, and authorities such as the Healthy Forest Restoration Act should be fully implemented for their full use to do the things that we need to do in terms of forest management on the landscape. More effective management of our federal forests will help shape them for the future. Under changing climatic conditions, it will also ensure that they're more resilient and better able to adapt. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to now recognize members to ask questions, and we're going to start off with Senator Franklin.
Thank you. I want, oh boy. Is that on? Yes. I want to thank Congressman Waxman and Senator Whitehouse for calling this. Before we even get into today's topic in terms of what is, I don't even think it's appropriate to say what caused it, but I want to just recognize at the outset the 19 firefighters who lost their lives, and our hearts all go out to them, and especially to Chief Litzenberg and to Mr. Swan. I'm on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Chief Tidwell has testified a number of times, and I've always brought this up. To what extent do scientists at at the Forest Service say that this, that the length of the season, the intensity of the fires, the size of the fires are exacerbated by climate change, and he says, yes. And I know you're one of his advisors on this. Is this a uniform, is this a consensus?
Senator Franken, what we see are the changing patterns that increase the exposure of our firefighters to the chances of being in a situation like this. No one fire, no one situation is caused by climate change. But the pattern, having longer fire seasons, having more larger fires, increases the house odds, if you will, for being in situations like this. That situation can happen at any time. So to answer your question,
I'm not saying is any one fire caused by climate change. What I'm saying is it a consensus among scientists who study this, that climate change is exacerbating the size, intensity, frequency, the longer season. Is that a consensus?
It's a consensus that the size and the season and in some cases the severity of the fires are exacerbated by climate change.
Okay, well, that's what I thought, and that's what I get every time I talk to the chief. So I think that you know, I want, and every time I bring this up in committee, I really ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who don't seem to want to talk about it, climate change, that this is costing us now. This isn't something that's going to be costing us. Hurricane Sandy, that storm cost $60 billion. And the sea level rising means that storm surges are going to cause more damage. Let me get to a specific, and which is about hazardous fuel. And when you're spending a higher and higher percentage of your budget on actually fighting fires that are happening, the testimony I'm hearing is that you have less money for clearing hazardous fuel. Is that right? And is that everyone kind of, I mean, that's what we just heard, right? Okay, so, and when you have an increase in the wilderness urban, what's the I for? Interface. Then we will also have a higher need, and yet we're underfunding it. So, but my question is that can we, do we need to find a way to get rid of this hazardous fuel, and can we use that hazardous fuel as biomass for electricity, for combined heat and power? In other words, could we turn this into something that we can actually use, and if so, help pay for it? Is that a strategy that makes any sense whatsoever? Well, no, anybody can jump in here.
Okay.
Maybe Mr. Summers.
A lot of work has been done looking to the cost factors on this, and depending on where the fuels are, the difficulty in reducing them, the steepest slope of the ecosystem, and that adds to the cost factors. Basic answer to your question is yes, you can salvage some of the cost involved in fuel removal by using the biomass for other purposes. Now, whether that entirely removes the cost in certain situations, it might, others will, but it will reduce the cost overall for removing fuels.
Seems like reducing costs is a good idea. At the same time that you're reducing hazardous fuel, it just seems like if you're going to reduce the cost, but also reduce the hazardous fuel. Let me ask one other thing, because I know everybody's got questions. Insects, and you're talking about the stressing of the forest, are things like the bark beetles living at higher altitudes.
Those pine beetles, I guess, are these causing more fires, or are they just killing trees, or both?
I think it contributes to both. The pine beetles in Colorado, we've lost 6 million acres to different forms of insects over the last 10 years. And so clearly the warmer and drier conditions we've had have exacerbated that issue. We haven't had the cold temperatures necessary to kill them.
And so they're surviving at higher altitudes, right?
Right, that's correct.
Yeah.
Right, we haven't had the extended cold temperatures. And the other thing is that while it's correct that once needles fall, there's not as many flashy fuels that can ignite, but dry fuel does ignite more readily. And one of the recent wildfires we had in southwestern Colorado in high elevation spruce fir forest that we used to call the asbestos forest, we saw a fire in dead Engelmann spruce run 7 miles in a day, and it's because of the structure of the trees, the fine fuels that are retained in the canopy. So yes, Senator, it's affecting both.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Could I just ask him before we go into something else to explain the asbestos belt
That is,
phrase that you use?
I like
Well,
that.
Okay, the high elevation spruce fir forest, because it normally retains snow really late in the year, we're talking from 9,000 to 11,500 feet. It's historically been referred to as that because it's cool, moist conditions with a lot of snowpack. And over the last 10 years, with the changing climatic conditions, we've seen that dry out earlier and become tinder that can cause large catastrophic fires.
Thank you for the interruption.
Representative Capps.
Thank you very much for holding this hearing, to my colleague, Mr. Waxman in the House and Senator Whitehouse. Very timely given the testimony that's been presented today, and I'm really pleased to be here and to also have a constituent in Fire Chief Rick Swan from my district. And just start out by saying how it comes to my memory being here, the memorial service just a couple of weeks ago for one of my constituents who, a young guy, 5 generations of firefighters, so eager to serve, couldn't get on the Vandenberg Hotshots, Vandenberg Air Force Base being in my district, and so it signed on to the Arizona Hotshots, whose life was one of the 19 that was tragically taken in that. And boy, there's nobody who fights fires better than the Hotshots, and for them to be caught in this firestorm and to lose that many of our elite fire crew tells you that the conditions have changed. I want to talk about sequestration with you, Mr. Swan, for a minute, and then I have a question for Dr. Summers. You know, we've had budget cuts, so we have seen our elite group of Vandenberg firefighter hotshots available locally, but ready to deploy other places as needed, pretty much dismantled, really cut back. And I want a comment from you on, if you would please, how is losing this team, the core essentials of it, impact our ability to combat wildfires in California and in the region?
Yeah, anytime you remove a resource from the availability to respond, you, in effect, take away from the toolbox that our incident commanders have. We see that all across California, for instance, with our inmate hand crews dwindling in population. And again, that just puts more pressure on the firefighters that we have. Those Vandenberg firefighters, I've worked with them many times. In fact, a good friend of mine was on them. And on the Central Coast, that is a huge vacuum on hand crews. The only hand crew we have available now are the ones in Ventura and the ones out of San Luis Obispo. So that opens up that whole Central Coast region there, other than the Forest Service hand crews that they have. So when you remove a resource or an asset, especially a nationwide asset, from your arsenal, you are going to cause those folks that are out there right now to stay longer, and thereby tax them even more. So it's a snowball effect. If you remove something, you still have to have the people to do the job. And if you remove an asset, that puts more pressure on those that are there.
Thank you very much. And if there's time, I'd like to ask Dr. Summers. I, in my time in Congress, being very aware of my constituency, been working on several measures so that we can help our local communities prepare for the impacts of climate change. Adaptation is a key word, and background is public health. The increased risk of wildfire is clearly one of these impacts. I mean, we know it's there. We've seen the testimony today. So what sort of planning and infrastructure improvements should we be making on the ground in our local communities to increase our resilience at the local level, but also, of course, that has a multiplying effect, and be able to face these, what we know will be an increase in the number of wildfires?
I started my career in Riverside, California, fire-led, so I'm familiar with the wildland and urban interface and those issues for a long, long time. There are many approaches. Basically, the most important, I think, is zoning when things are put in, that the access roads, all the other factors to prepare a community for fire are put in correctly. Certainly fire retardant materials on houses, California going from shake roofs to tile or other things is a big factor. There are things homeowners and communities can do, clearing brush away from houses and so on. In fact, a lot of these issues are very well studied. NFPA has put out through Firewise Communities, has a lot of guidelines the Forest Service has done, and so on. I think in looking around the country, the two areas of concern are that as these fire risks increase, they are hitting communities which do not have the experience that Southern Californians would have. So again, crews and municipalities are having to deal with situations without a great experience base. So again, the training and safety for the crews has to go out there. And that, I think the other one, and that's, I won't comment on recent fatalities because of the ongoing investigation, but it's been an increasing concern of mine, and that's why I mentioned policy guidance for firefighters, that we're putting our crews in danger because of the wildland urban. There was a classic example a few years in Southern California, in which a crew was burned up, Forest Service crew, protecting structures in a wildland urban interface fire. So I have a great deal of concern that we're jeopardizing or putting our crews at higher risk because of the convolution of the increased fire intensities in that and the values of the wildland urban interface. And it's very hard for firefighters or dedicated crews to not protect homes, not do stuff like that, but certainly the policy of how we handle this with the increasing risks, I think, is a critical issue for firefighter safety and one that needs a lot more attention.
Well, thank you. And just in closing, you underscore what Chief Swan, I think, so rightly pointed out. This is not simply a matter of the number of crew that you have at a site, but the lack of a proper day off to restore your commitment to this. The long-term wear and tear on these. We're asking them to do incredible things today, and now we're asking them to do it with fewer people over longer periods of time. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Capps. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Let me follow up a little bit on Representative Capps's point. It strikes me that the firefighters who deploy into this environment are operating at really maximum levels of human fitness and endurance. In some cases, meeting or even probably exceeding the fitness of Olympic athletes in order to be able to sustain that level of effort in that environment. Could you, I guess, Mr. Swan and Chief Litzenberg particularly, could you just a little bit what the operating environment is like for a human being trying to fight a wildfire in terms of the level of effort, the temperature that you're trying to operate in, and are we seeing that level of physical demand changing as a result of the changes we've talked about in the fire environment?
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. The environment is, well, first of all, you're wearing a protective clothing that is not yet necessarily very breathable. We have some studies going on currently to try to at least bring those fabrics up to modern standards, which we think are going to substantially increase the comfortability of our firefighters. The things that we're finding out more often are not the tragedies of Yarnell that are occurring, which are just devastating, but we're seeing more injuries occurring on the heat stress of firefighters cooking on the inside than having these tragedies like Yarnell. So you place yourself in these, and we're not like in the structural firefighters where you have the heavy suits and things, but you're still wearing protective clothing, a 40-pound pack, give or take. You're out in the wildland. If you're not on a fire engine, you're out in, you've got to bring everything with you. You bring food, water, gasoline for your chainsaws, the whole bit. These folks train on a regular basis, probably hike at least an hour a day, every day, not what we would consider hiking around here, but up and down hills and working to, that's the environment that they work in. And now you add into this the climates, and thank goodness in California, the humidity is not necessarily one of those factors that we have to bring in, and of course that adds to the intensity of the fire, but now you add the heat to this, and we are stressing our firefighters, and these, while you train and you try to acclimate yourself to the climate, because you're wearing all your gear, you're wearing everything you're supposed to be wearing, so you know what's going on. There are issues in there as far as the heat stress that's concerning. There are issues of the other knee injuries, ankle injuries, those sort of things, that are just over and over and over again. And as Representative Capps was talking about, that increased activity, the fewer staff, the more you're out there, the more you expose yourself to these environments. So I hope I guess provide a little bit of a picture on that. Chief, you want to add something?
Yeah, again, Senator Whitehouse, thank you for asking that question, because I think it is important. I don't know that necessarily, well, the conditions are clearly hotter and drier, the seasons are getting longer, and I think our resources are being spread more thin than they were in the past. I think the major change as far as the impacts on firefighters has come with our understanding of just what you said, which is that these people are performing really at a professional athlete level. And we've come to a greater understanding of what kind of impact that has on these people. And with that understanding comes a responsibility to do something about it. And so we've had to train people better, and we've had to equip them better. And we've simply had to get more people out on the line to respond to these increased stressors. So is the question, has there been an impact? Yeah, there has. And a lot of that is because we have a better understanding of the impacts that we're having on these people, which is overall a good thing, because it leads to a safer environment.
And when you say these increased stressors, to use your phrase, what specifically are you referring to?
When we're talking about longer seasons, resources that are spread thin, fires that are lasting longer, hotter environments, drier environments, simply extending a season longer puts more impact on people. And when you're dealing with budgets that aren't necessarily increasing, so we don't have more money to pay people, more money to hire more people, it's an increased stressor all around.
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse. We're so frustrated here in Congress for a number of reasons. This is a Seinfeld moment for the Congress. It's a program about doing nothing, and that's what the Congress is all about. And two areas of great frustration to me is that we have the leadership in the House of Representatives denying climate change or refusing to even recognize it. It's not an issue for them. And then the leadership in the Congress ignoring the impact of the sequestration, as if these cuts don't make any difference. It seems to me that our witnesses today have brought home both points. You particularly, Mr. Listenberg, you were talking about these different programs that are now not being funded the way they were originally intended, and the reduction in those funds is making your job, the job of all those who have to deal with these fires, harder. Tell us some specifics.
Representative, thanks again. Another good question for us, because the funding is absolutely certainly having an impact on us locally. Let me use, I'll start with an anecdotal, we've had a lot of data that's been through it. Let me give you an example, both of my upbringing and what I deal with now, and then I'll get specifically to your question. Growing up in New Mexico, the few decades that I can recall as a youngster, I think I can count on one hand the number of significant fires that I watched in our valley that were visible from my home. And the first I can remember is La Mesa Fire, which was 1977. I think it burned in the neighborhood of 5,000 acres. And at the time that seemed quite significant. In the 90s, in the same area, there were a couple fires of significance. And at that time, I think the bigger one was 15,000 acres. And again, it seemed like it really changed our world. And then I got in the firefighting business and I started paying more attention. Significant fire in 2000, the Cerro Grande fire in Los Alamos, obviously destroyed a large part of that community in the neighborhood of 50,000 acres. It redefined how we see fire, redefined how we have to deploy our resources, and it really redefined how we can allocate funds to keep us safe and to help our communities be safe. And that's only changed, significantly grown in the last decade. And now I can say this year alone, on one hand, we've had that many fires that I can see from my community. So when it was previously 1 or 2 fires in a decade, now we're having 1 or 2 fires in a year. So then you get to the funding question. And we're having to deal with that. 97% of fires are dealt with by local resources, but the truth is 100% of fires start locally. They start right here, and we have to deal with them. And when we're having 4 and 5 of these, and they're extended over longer periods, our resources are cut then, and we're really taking, whether it be funding, people, sweat equity, we're taking resources away that could be dealing with the resilience that you speak of, dealing with creating fire-adapted communities, dealing with the fuel reduction programs that we think can make a difference if we're continually doing them, things that we think can make a community safer over the long run. And there are programs, we've mentioned Firewise, there's a Ready, Set, Go program that helps communities and helps fire departments get in their communities and address safety in the wildland-urban interface. But when you're talking about funding that's being taken, even those programs are hard to dedicate to because, plain and simply, our resources are dedicated to keeping our people safe and responding appropriately.
So when we shortchange the funding, we're just making everything worse and putting more firefighters at risk.
Representative, I think that's a good summary.
Well, I think all of our witnesses, from what I hear you saying, climate change is getting worse. The dangers in terms of forest fires are growing. That the costs of minimizing the risk beforehand or fighting the fires and picking up the pieces afterwards are all going up. So we've got to pay attention. And I just want to note that as we sit here at this moment, there are 28 active wildfires burning in 9 states. These fires have ravaged almost 300,000 acres of land. Not far from my own district in Southern California, the mountain fire recently forced more than 6,000 people to evacuate their homes. These fires are not only disruptive in destruction, but they can be deadly, particularly for those of you who protect us from wildfires. 192 firefighters died fighting wildfires between 2002 and 2012. This year, 24 more have died, including the 19 firefighters battling the Yarnell Hill fire. And since 2006, the United States has experienced 6 fire seasons with an estimated cost of more than $1 billion. This is absurd for the Congress or the American people to think, well, we've always had fires, and so we're getting a few more. We just can't ignore a problem that's getting worse, it's going to continue to get worse. And of course, this isn't the only problem that we're facing because of climate change. So I think we've got to wake up the American people and their representatives that we've got to deal with this issue of climate change by trying to prevent it from getting worse, trying to adapt to it, pay for the funds that we're going to have to pay, because we've already put so much greenhouse gases in the air that even if we stop the continuation of the pollution, we're going to have problems still continue for many, many years. That's what our Bicameral Task Force is all about. Bring this problem out into the open. In the House of Representatives, we can't even get a hearing to know from the scientists what is happening. I'm going to request that we get a hearing to hear from the firefighters. And there are other issues that we want to explore. We've got to bring these issues out so the American people understand it and realize that we're long overdue for action. Senator Whitehouse, do you want to make any concluding comments?
Let me first thank Representative Waxman. He is an inspiration to work with on the Bicameral Task Force. This is one of many issues where he has shown extraordinary leadership during his long career in the House, and it gives me real pride to have the chance to work with him on this. I'm also extremely grateful to our witnesses.